Hello there, hope you are doing well. Hope you are very excited about the China Personal Information Protection Law, which has just come into force. It came into force on the 1st of November 2021. So depending when you're watching this, it's literally brand new. If you're watching this, I know 50 years in the future, you're probably wondering what all the fuss is about and who is this guy talking to me about laws that are way outdated. But at the moment, it is big news. It is big news because it is essentially China's version of the GDPR. It imposes similar penalties, similar requirements in terms of collection of data, processing of data, and transmission of data outside the jurisdiction. And it means if you are a business doing business in China, if you are collecting Chinese data, personal data, well, I would say any data actually, but personal data in particular for this law, you need to make sure that you've read this law, you understand it, and you comply with it. That is whether you're collecting it or whether you're transmitting it outside of the Chinese mainland, because that is something where you need a separate consent for as well. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about what the law entails. I've already done a video on that. You can watch that. I'll put a link at the end of this video so you can go back and listen. What I want to talk about instead is designated representatives, or DPOs, data protection officers. Now, they're two kind of separate things in the GDPR. There are two separate articles that deal with them. So you have to have a designated representative if you're not based in the EU, who essentially deals with any concerns as to whether you're complying with the GDPR. But you can also have a data protection officer, and you may be required to, who is essentially the boss, the person in charge, the Captain Picard of, reference doesn't necessarily work, does it? But the Captain Picard of data protection within your organization, making sure you're processing data correctly, you're collecting data correctly, consent's being obtained, that model clauses are being adhered to, and dealing with any complaints that come in, be they data requests or complaints from the relevant authority. Now, the Chinese law has a similar requirement for a designated representative only. It doesn't necessarily call them a DPO, but DPOs do exist in China. You have individuals within organizations who are responsible for data management, data handling. And their role, certainly pre the new law, was really more of a technology-based role, I would say. It was one where you're making sure the data is being kept safe, you make sure you have compliance with applicable laws, you're essentially making sure that everything's stored carefully and you're collecting it and you don't lose it, and probably advising how to process it most effectively. But that has all changed in a big way, because the DPO, in whichever jurisdiction, but certainly in China, is essentially the person who is, I think of them as the CEO of data. That's probably the best way to think of it. Think of them as the person in charge. And I want to read an extract from the new Chinese law. So the Chinese law sets out penalties. Penalties for failure to comply. So if you process data incorrectly, if you collect data without required consent, and heaven forbid you transfer data outside of China without getting proper consent or abiding by the rules there, you can face penalties that are similar to GDPR. So it's 50 million renminbi, or 5% of your annual turnover. It's suspension of your business, pretty severe, that's bigger than the GDPR. Criminal liability, of course, but also the person in charge can face a personal fine of up to 1 million renminbi. And I would argue can probably face a similar penalty in terms of criminal liability as well. So you may find they're jailed. Now, there was a case back in August, I think, 2021. I should really have pulled out my piece of paper before I read the name of the case. The case was called, and this doesn't really quite trip off the tongue, Sanso Rondon versus LexisNexis Fixed Solutions UK Limited, and the case reference will be on the screen if I remember to put the titles up correctly. This case held that a data protection officer, the person in charge of the data, was not the person liable if something went wrong. So suppose that you suffer a data breach and you think it's a data issue, it's the company who's at fault. You can't blame the data protection officer and say it's all their fault. They don't face the fine themselves. Now, you could, if you've hired a data protection officer, and you can hire external ones, there are plenty of options online. If you Google DPO, you'll get inundated with possible solutions, both tiny companies, individuals acting alone, all the way to some of the big information technology companies will offer this service. Now, you could probably sue them. You could probably make a claim under your contract with them, but they wouldn't face liability themselves. However, that position is completely different in China, and the role of a DPO, and I'm using designated representative of GDP and DPO interchangeably, by the way, if you haven't already guessed, becomes quite a precarious position to be in. So suppose you are the DPO for any large organisation, actually just pluck one out of the air. Suppose you're the DPO for someone like Alibaba. So they process vast amounts, collect vast amounts of data. And you cannot be sure, as the designated individual, as the DPO, you cannot be sure everything that's going on within that organisation. Not necessarily because you're not being told, it's just too vast. There is so much information going on that I doubt anyone, even Jack Ma, probably doesn't know exactly what's going on in terms of all of the processing activities. But suppose there's a complaint, there's a breach of the new personal information protection law, and yes, something has gone wrong. Consent has not been acquired correctly. Data's been taken from minors. Who knows? Something bad happens. You, as the data protection officer, as the designated individual, will probably be deemed to be the person in charge in respect of the new law. That means you will personally face a fine. And that fine will probably be for every incident. And it's probably a lot more than you're being paid. So this makes the life of a DPO in China quite a challenging role. Not one, to be honest, I probably wouldn't want to take it on because, again, I wouldn't be convinced that everyone was collecting data and processing data the way that I want them to. But more because I wouldn't want to be facing a fine that's probably more than I would earn in any given year, and I could face it multiple times depending on how many infractions they may be. And this has created a big problem. It's not just a problem for the DPO, it's a problem for foreign organisations who want to actually have someone based in China, as they're required to by the law, a designated representative, who may then face personal liability if something goes wrong. I'm finding, and certainly my clients find, that one, if you can find someone to do it at all, they're certainly asking for a lot of money, you have to pay them a lot, and they're asking for various indemnities in the case of breach. So if they get fined, you essentially have to pay them the fine. I actually think fair enough in practice. If I was an individual, I have the same thing, but it's a massive cost in terms of a foreign organisation who's then collecting data, processing data, transferring data out of China, and I don't see how that's going to be resolved. I said when I did the previous video on the new law, said there would be a cottage industry set up, but now it looks like it's going to be a multi-million renminbi industry in terms of people are essentially, you're paying them to take on liability. I mean, previously you were paying a DPO under the GDPR just to make sure that you were compliant with the law and deal with any requests. Now you're saying, ensure we comply with the law, deal with any requests, and by the way, be prepared to take the hit if we screw something up. And I don't know who would be prepared to take that on. But that's it for now. I am waiting to see how this transpires. Just even reading in the press, I'm seeing that China DPOs are feeling themselves under a lot of pressure. They're wondering whether it's worth actually doing the job at all. They're seeing that their role has essentially shifted from one where they were just essentially acting as a data controller or data processor supervisor to one where they themselves are in charge. They have essentially gone from being sort of relatively technology-focused employee to someone who has now got the same risks, the same responsibilities as someone who would be on the CEO, CFO level, and that can be a bit of a shock. And many videos ago, probably last year, I said that at some point, I'm sure we will see a designated class, almost like being a specialist, like a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer, of data professionals. And I don't mean in terms of data analytics, I mean one that understands the law and understands the technology and understands the processing, and that profession will be coming into demand. I think China has just pushed that way forward. And this whole personal liability of an individual who is essentially acting as a DPO is probably the biggest step we've had in this for some time, because in a role that big, with liability that big, you've got to be very well versed in what you're doing, very knowledgeable, and most of all, very, very accountable. So there we go, that's it for the moment. Hope you enjoyed this. I'd be interested on your views, particularly if you're trying to find a DPO in China, where you're finding them, what people are asking for, whether people are actually willing to do the job, or also if there is a person within your organization who is doing that role at the moment and you operate in China and they're based in China, are they still doing it? Are they prepared to still take it on? Because as I said, I don't know if I would be. Anyway, if you have any questions, let me know. By all means, ask them in the comments, either in the YouTube video or on LinkedIn, which is probably where I posted this. Have a good one. I'll be back with more. Maybe if I get some answers, I'll feed back and do a follow-up on this, but we'll see. I'll be back with more very, very soon. Take care.